Okay, am I live? Am I live? Okay, I'm going to pretend like I'm live whether I am or not. And I will start talking like I'm live. I see my daughter Nina has joined us from Amsterdam. Hello, Nina. So I am going to just assume that you guys can see me, and if you can, oh, you are live, good. I always like that confirmation. Okay, so just to let you guys know what's going on, I haven't done a Technique Tuesday video in a couple of weeks, and that is because I'm preparing to do a series of technique videos that just take more preparation, and trying to prepare for something like that and also do a technique video every week on top of that is just a little too much. And so I thought that I would do a live stream, a Q&A today. So chime in, and I see a lot of people started chiming in where they're from and what they're working on. And so if you have a question for me today, and you could have a question about just me, about knitting, techniques, constructions, any kind of thing like that, you can ask me. And if you have a question, type the word question in capital letters in the chat, because that just makes it easier for me to see. If you've already written a question and you didn't do that, that's fine. It just, because I'll be talking to the camera, and then I'll go check the live chat to see what people have asked, and it just jumps out easier at me if I can do that. So I'm talking to you here from, it is now sunny, I'm looking out the window, sunny Minneapolis, Minnesota. We were getting snow earlier, so now we're getting some sunshine. So I hope the weather is good where you are. And I'm just going to quick look and see if we can get started with some of the questions. So, you do some fascinating vintage pattern knits, but do you experiment or use vintage yarns too? So my next vintage project, which I've done some swatching for, and I showed you guys the schematic that I created for it, is a 1960s sweater. And I bought these vintage sweater kits a couple of weeks ago off eBay. And so I will be using an actual vintage yarn for those projects. But I have bought a couple of vintage yarns previously just so that I can understand what those yarns were. And I think they're in a bin right below me. So I have, I've got yarn and paper and pen here in case you guys have questions and I need to do an overhead. But I will switch to the overhead now so you can see this yarn. Some of you, let me switch to the overhead. You can still see me. I need to put my bin back in. Okay, let me change this. Okay, so this is some Shetland floss yarn. When I was knitting my 1920s sweater last year, I read what the gauge of the yarn was supposed to be, which was 5 stitches per inch, and I assumed that meant that it was a worsted weight yarn. And so I bought worsted weight yarn for my project, and it turned out that was fine. But what I was noticing in the 1920s knit along that I was participating in the All Things Vintage group was that a lot of people were choosing patterns from the same book. It was a Corticelli book from 1922, and a lot of the patterns in that book called for Shetland floss. And this apparently was a very common type of yarn. Every yarn company had this, and I could find it in ads from like the 1860s and 70s all the way up into 1960 even. So it was really common, and then it just disappeared and nobody knew what it was. And what I saw in the Corticelli book was that different sweater patterns were using Shetland floss, And sometimes they would say use 2 strands of it to do the garter stitch hem and then switch to 1 strand. They didn't say to change the needle size. They said to use the same strand. Some projects had different colors, like stripes of color, and at the transition from one color to another, they wanted you to use a strand of each of the colors at the transition point and then just switch to 1 strand of the new color. And I couldn't understand what that yarn was. I contacted the Shetland Museum. They didn't know what it was. So I went on eBay and I found some vintage Shetland floss. Now on camera, this looks more red. This is more of a terracotta color of red. So it wasn't particularly a color I ever thought I would use. I just wanted to see what this yarn was like. So the descriptions of this yarn were that it was a hairy 2-ply yarn and that it was good for certain types of garments. And I don't know how well you can see that if I can bring it up and let me, if I get that out of the camera, can you see if it's going to focus on the yarn? It does match that written description, but from the written description, I wouldn't have figured it out. It's not really quite like a 2-ply jumper weight like you'd get from Jamieson and Smith. It's different, but it's certainly, I suspect that it's woolen spun, but I really don't know how it was created. But I did some swatching with it to try to understand what this fabric would have been like if I knit with it from my sweater. And for my sweater, it called for 2 strands of this for the hem, and then it never said to cut one of the strands. So it should have been double-stranded for the entire thing. So I was confident that a worsted weight yarn was a good substitute for 2 strands of this. But I have done that, and there's another yarn that I have in a bag here it's called Germantown yarn, but it's I think the term Germantown just became a word people used to describe something that was less specific than was used early on. So I think in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, they used specific names for specific types of yarn, and that meant something really specific. And then as time went on, they may have used that term for other reasons. So I hope that answers your question. I'm going to go back to face only. Okay, so somebody is watching me while she's on her treadmill, so good for you. We finally went for a walk yesterday. Okay, hello from Colorado. I love knitting hats, but I've never seen you do a video on ladderback jacquard. What is your preferred method for catching floats? I tend to catch by the weave and trap method, not weaving constantly, but just trapping in that method. What I really like to do is to try to find stitch patterns that have a short span of stitches rather than one that's going to need trapping. So most of like true Fair Isle knitting will generally have small spans of stitches. They will switch colors more often, and then you don't need to trap floats. I have tried that ladderback technique. I used the one that Susan Rainey was showing. She has a pattern called It's Not About the Hat. So it's a hat pattern, but the purpose of the hat pattern is to teach that technique. So I did try that at one point. I don't do tons of color work, and when I do color work, I need to really pay attention to my tension. So I try to minimize anything that's going to cause me tension issues. So if I can, I try to use short spans. So you probably won't ever see me do a video on that technique just because I don't feel competent to teach it. I just don't use it enough to know like the tricks and the things to tell you guys to look out for. Hello from Holland in the Netherlands. My daughter Nina has a neighbor that has joined us. Okay, Central California, Georgia, Germany, Wisconsin, Australia. You woke up. You woke up. I think I said I was going to do this live stream on Sunday, and when I do it at this time of the day, it is tomorrow in Australia and New Zealand. So had a couple of confused people who got up very early yesterday in order to see this live stream. I would like the best way to seamlessly join an I-cord cast on in the round. So if I'm not completely sure if you mean, so there is an I-cord cast on, there's an I-cord bind off. There are a couple of ways to use I-cord in order to start a project, and there is a method called the I-cord cast on, which I have used, but I've only used it when knitting flat, and I don't particularly like it. So I tend, if I need an I-cord around an edge, I will use a provisional cast on that gives me live stitches, and then I do an I-cord bind off. And so I do have a video on how to do, like if you're doing I-cord bind off or attached I-cord around a border, and then how you join the end of that I-cord to the start. And I would imagine, you know, I'm trying to think with an I-cord cast on though, it does make that trickier. So I think that would probably be my workaround, would be provisional cast on so that you have live stitches, recapture them later and do an I-cord bind off, because then it's a very simple matter to attach the end. And I do remember now going through this in my head a few years ago and trying to figure out a way to do that with an I-cord cast on, and I didn't come up with a good way. Somebody may have, but I haven't come up with a good one. Okay, oh, hello Minneapolis, South Georgia, UK, Poland, Spain, Alaska. Don't sweat the tech problems, you're amongst friends. I sweat them anyway. The half hour before I go live, I'm a wreck. Do you, okay, that was the vintage. Can steeking be done with part acrylic or 100%, with yarn that is part acrylic or 100%? I think you can steek with just about anything, and it's the steeking method that you use that's going to make a difference. So if you were using something like superwash wool or cotton or acrylic or something like that that doesn't felt, I would use a machine sewn way of securing the stitches. I have only ever done steeking in a class, and we did 3 different methods, but we were using wool. I'm going to move this out of the way. And so from my limited knowledge, if I was going to use something like that, I would want it to be as secure as possible, and I would machine sew those down. I've discovered mosaic knitting. Why would anybody use Fair Isle with its hassle of carrying floats when one can knit in mosaic? It's a different colorwork technique. It does not produce the same result. There are ways of doing stranded color work by slipping the stitches, that by working the stitches in, say, color A and slipping the stitches in color B, and then on the next round, and then working that round a second time by working the stitches that should have been worked in color B. But that is not the same as what you're doing with mosaic knitting. With mosaic knitting, those slip stitches remain slipped, so they remain elongated relative to the stitches that were actually worked. So it's a different technique, and it produces different proportion stitches. It's just not the same. So you would do one versus the other because of the effect that you wanted with mosaic knitting versus the effect that you would want with stranded color work. Do I have a video on how I tension my yarn? I'm binging your backlog, but haven't found that one yet. If you just mean how do I wind it around my fingers, I can show you that. Let me switch again to the overhead. Now, and every knitter is different. What works for one knitter is not going to work for another. I think one of the things I've been trying to really explain to people especially in the past year or so, is that there's more to knitting style than what hand you hold the yarn in and how your fingers are positioned. There's also just how you hold the needles. So I do things differently when I'm knitting with the yarn in my right hand than when I'm knitting with the yarn in my left hand, and that has to do with a lot of things. Let me turn this a little more. So if I am knitting continental, I bring the working yarn. I'm very close to the needle, and I have the working yarn end is hanging down, and so the needle is up here, and it's coming from the outside, and it comes around. And then it's under those ring and middle finger, and then it comes over my index finger. And I keep my index finger extended, but you can see how I'm holding my needles. I'm not really holding the needle, and this needle is kind of leaned up against my hand here. So some people keep their fingers very close, but they're holding their hands differently. They're holding them so that they're more against the fabric, and there's probably as many different ways of doing this as there are knitters. So knitters who, you know, how you tension your yarn is sort of independent of how you're holding your needles, but that's how I do mine. When I first started knitting continental, I was keeping my pinky finger clenched pretty tight, and so I could only knit a few stitches, and then I was out of tension, and then I would have to let this finger loose to release some yarn, and then I could knit a few more, and then I would have to release that again. And over the years, what has happened is that I just don't have it clamped as tightly, and it's just constantly running through my fingers without me having to do this business at all. I mean, once in a while, if it's yarn is sticky or it's thick or something like that, I might have to do that. Now, if I'm working with a really thick yarn, I might skip that ring finger altogether, or pinky finger, and just have it over my index finger. And that's because it just puts too much drag on the yarn for it to be around if it's a really thick yarn. Now lately, I have been, in preparation for the series of videos that I was talking about, I've been knitting with a lace weight yarn on very fine needles, like a size 1 needle. And what I have found is that I need to double wrap that just because it's so fine that the way that I tension the yarn doesn't provide enough tension. So I have to double wrap that. I've had to do that before with slippery yarns like bamboo yarn. I've had to do that before too. So I do adjust how I tension the yarn based on how thick the yarn is. Okay, have I thought about trying to find some of the vintage yarns to try in some of the vintage patterns? I don't know if that's the same question that I had before. For the really old vintage patterns or antique patterns, there's just no way, like the older something is, the less common it is. So being able to find a yarn from the 1890s or even 1910 is going to be really, really difficult. The kits I bought from the 1960s, those are 50 or 60 years old. So there's just more of those around there. And that's one of the reasons I was so excited about that, was that I could work a pattern with the actual yarn. And then I'm using probably a yarn from the kit that's probably from the 70s for the 60s, and I'll be using 60s yarn for 1940s. But at least I have some idea. I haven't had good luck using your alternate decrease for the afterthought heel. Mine had ladders. Any ideas or options? I sometimes get ladders with that too. I was going to try it again recently. I've been using a central double decrease for my my heels, and I've been wanting to try again the 2 increases or 2 decreases. And one of the reasons is because I do sometimes get that ladder. What I have to do when I use a double decrease is reorient the stitches so that the decrease line is in the center of my half of the round that I'm working on. And so I'm going to try that with the two sets of decreases and see if that helps. I think when they're separated on one needle and another, that can create more of a ladder. But that's as good an answer as I have for you on that. That's something I'm trying to solve myself. Did those vintage knitting kits include a pattern for the skirt? They did not. And I think that's because these are kits that are put together by yarn companies or companies that manufacture the wool. Like the pattern that I did get was produced by a publishing company. So it was a knitting pattern that was produced by a publishing company called the Zwartbles, W-A-T-M-O-U-G-H. And so they are not sewing companies. So I don't know if they ever were, but it seems like from what I've seen from the ads that they came from places that sold wool products like yarn and fabric, and it wasn't like a sewing store necessarily. So I don't really know the reason for that. Maybe they assumed people had a favorite skirt pattern. I really don't know. Let's see. Have I ever watched the video? Shetland knitters really did knit 200 stitches a minute. The speed is astounding, but they're knitting left-handed. I don't know what you mean by left-handed. Do you mean that they're holding the yarn in their left hand? I think some of the books that I have read about Shetland knitting talks about the various ways that people handle the yarn. You could handle both yarns in the right hand, you could handle both in the left, or one in each hand. And one of the books I had said that they had heard that these were all three different methods, and they had never seen a Shetland knitter doing it one particular way out of those three. So I don't know. I think that there might be knitters who handle one yarn in each hand. I think that's really common. So, and that works really well for Fair Isle knitting, where you want to keep the two strands parallel to have one in each hand. And I'm still doing the overhead even though I'm talking to the camera. Sometimes I do not pay attention to what's going on around me, you guys. Let's see. Question, did you compile a list of companies that make woolen spun yarn? I bought a woolen spun from a few companies, but you can use the website yarnsub.com. I did an interview with Wendy from Yarnsub a few months ago, and you can search her website based on yarns that are woolen spun. So on that website, they tell you if it's the default is that it's worsted spun, and if a yarn is woolen spun, she will tell you that in the database. Now, occasionally there are things that she misses, and maybe a yarn really is woolen spun and she hasn't mentioned that, and she would gladly welcome corrections. But if you are looking for woolen spun yarns specifically, that's probably the best place. Because some places that make traditional yarns like Jameson & Smith and Jameson's of Shetland have both woolen spun and worsted spun yarns, and they will indicate which is which in all of their different yarns. Brooklyn Tweed started out with woolen spun yarns, and now they have some that are worsted spun. But I think that's the best way of looking. I was really on a search for yarns that had a Z twist, which is applied in the opposite way that most commercially manufactured yarns are, and I was kind of surprised at how many small mills were ones that were doing it in that direction. But I think I had a conversation with a friend last year when you could do that, and she thought that most of the woolen spun yarns were yarns that were being produced by designers who are creating their own yarn companies. I thought that was an interesting thought on that. Let's see. From my 4-year-old daughter, Lila, do I have a cat? Not anymore. My cat, Katie, when I was finishing up the Master Hand Knitting program, it was right before my 50th birthday. And my cat, Katie, who was a boy cat, but I thought was a girl when I got him, and I named him Katie, and I didn't want to change his name. But he used to sit right here next to my computer and like stare at the screen when I was editing my papers. And he died the next month. He was 20 years old. So I had been with Katie Cat longer than I had been with my husband at that point. But most of us in the house are allergic, and I don't mind tolerating a cat, even though I'm allergic. But we haven't had another cat since. We did have a couple of dogs that have each died as well, but I've really been wanting to get a pet in the past year, and I keep looking and looking, and I haven't found one yet. Let's see. Tell Lila, thank you for the question. Would I be able to switch your view back? Yes. Where did you find your vintage kits? Okay, I've been getting this question a lot since I did the live stream. I got them off eBay, and I talked a little bit about this in my Friday video about suggestions about how to go about finding these. I think, what happened was somebody in my Ravelry group said, oh, those kits were really popular in the 60s. I just bought one off eBay because I'd found out about a certain company that had made those kits. And I assumed that was their idea and nobody else did it. And this person said, no, those were really common. And so I'm like, oh, and I ran over to eBay immediately, and there was like 4 kits available at that particular time, and I ended up buying 3 of them. And so when I unboxed them, a lot of people watched that video, and a lot of people have been looking for them. So I think it just might take some time to find them. I did show some different advertisements for different companies in the Friday video to help maybe give an idea of something more specific to search for. But I think, it's just going to take time, and you can enter your search terms like for a watch list on eBay. There might be some on Etsy as well. Somebody commented, and it might have been the person who told me about these kits to begin with. Brunswick was another company that produced those. So I think it's just going to take time. It can take time. It took me a year before I was able to find any vintage knitting manuals from the first half of the 20th century because I didn't have a title. And so once I had a title, and then I had some authors and a publisher, that sent me on the path to be able to find more. But I think there's a few people out there looking for them right now, and so maybe it might take a few months before some more pop up on eBay without somebody else snatching it up. Continued from above. I don't know what's continued from above. Something about 2 yarns aren't tightly spun. I don't know. I don't know what that is about. Is there an easy way to do contrast cuff, heel, and toe without a million ends to weave in? Also, how to do scrappy striping in socks? So I use socks as a mindless thing, and so I don't want a lot of ends, so I don't do scrappy socks. And the problem with sock yarn is that it tends to have nylon and be superwash, and so you can't just felt the ends together. That would be probably what I would do if it was not superwash. But for contrast, I've done some videos on how you can do that without cutting the yarn. Like, you can do the whole leg and foot without cutting that yarn. You do have to, of course, with a contrast, you're going to have 2 ends when you join a contrast, the starting end and the ending end. You're always going to have 2 ends to any ball of yarn that you are using. So if you limit it to just a heel or just toes, then at least that reduces the number. But I don't know how else you're going to do it unless you, yeah, I don't know how else you're going to do it. Oh, this just jumped. Let's see. Can you summarize your experience with the Zwartbles yarn? Was it hard to work with? How's the feel? I'm thinking about getting that myself. So what I learned, the Zwartbles yarn is the yarn that I use to make the sweater that I was wearing in Friday's video. It's a yarn from a black sheep. I would say, and this yarn is very different from like the yarn that I used in it. This is the regular old, this is probably like Cascade 220, which is a worsted spun yarn. And it has what's called an S twist. That means the angle of the twist is the same angle as the middle of a letter S. That's very common for commercial yarn. So this is like the most generic type of yarn you can probably find. This had there was a Z ply, so the angle of the twist was the same angle that you would see in the middle of a letter Z, and that's opposite from what a lot of commercial yarns are. So it felt a little different. That just having that made it feel a little different. This is a woolen spun yarn instead of worsted spun, so it's stickier and fuzzier and more open. And so that's the kind of yarn that's often recommended for color work because it's so sticky. It makes steeking really easy. You can cut the wool. You don't have to worry about it fraying. So it had these two qualities, plus it was Zwartbles. So I would say that my experience so far working with woolen spun yarns is they tend to feel a little rougher when you're knitting with them. But when you wash them, they soften. Now, it doesn't become merino wool. It's not that soft. But definitely this against my neck, like I'm aware that there's wool, but for some reason it's not prickly the way a worsted spun yarn like this, if this felt a little itchy, it would still feel itchy against my neck later, whereas the woolen spun is different. So what I would like to do at some point is experiment with some Zwartbles yarn that was spun more like what I was used to, and then I'd really be able to compare the difference between one wool and another. When the entire yarn construction is different, it's hard to tell what aspect is because of the breed of the sheep and which aspect is because of the way the wool was prepared and the way that it was spun. So the thing that was hardest, I think, about this was just that it was so dark and it was really hard to see when I was knitting. And what was really, really hard was the seaming. I tend to prefer knitting smaller pieces and seaming. This was probably one of the most challenging seaming tasks that I've had because it was just so dark. Oh, Daphne. Thank you. This is the first time I've had the super chat thing set up. I didn't know that it was actually going to work. So thank you very much, Daphne. You are very welcome. Are you guys having trouble hearing me? Somebody said they're having trouble hearing me. What size is the fabric in the kits? The kits, the fabric that I got, it's kind of interesting because it's one of them actually states exactly what it is, and I thought it was really interesting. It's a 1 3/4 yards, 27 inches wide, and that seems pretty typical. 27 to 28 inches wide when it's this hand woven. These were hand woven. But I know somebody who got a kit, a friend bought at a garage sale here in town, and originally that kit had come from a local department store, and the wool was from Pringle of Scotland, but it was a wider piece of fabric. It was like 54 inches wide, but there was only a yard of it. So I think it's considered a skirt length, and of course skirts were different, needed different amounts of material in different time periods. So I'm really curious about how big a skirt I can actually end up knitting with this. I haven't looked into that very much. Let's see. How do I decide what topics to cover in my Technique Tuesday videos? I have a spreadsheet, which you guys have heard me talk about my spreadsheets many times. Let me get this, see if I can get that out of the way. Before I started doing Technique Tuesday videos, and it was like the end of 2016, and the yarn shop where I taught had closed, she'd retired, and I had to think about what I was going to do with my teaching. Was I going to try to find another shop or do something different? My husband said, why don't you try doing YouTube videos again? Because I'd done them now and again over the previous like 10 years. I hadn't done any for a couple of years. And I had never been able to generate very many ideas. And mostly it was because I thought in my head I had to come up with something completely different from what anybody else has done. And then I realized that the way I teach is different from the way other people teach. Every teacher is different, and every student is going to respond to different teachers in different ways, and that I didn't have to only generate ideas for weird knitting techniques, because that I could do things that were more common, that there were more videos for. So I generated a list of 150 ideas. And that just made me realize, okay, I certainly have enough ideas for a year. And so that first year, I kind of tried to group them by month. Like, here's what I'm going to do for this month. Here's what I'm going to do for that month. And I kind of went through the year that way, and I really learned how to do a technique video. And then, but as I'm doing these technique videos, I always come up with other ideas. So sometimes people are asking, I'll see the same question come up over and over, like in the technique forums on Ravelry, for example. I'll see something come up over and over again. Or somebody will ask me a question specifically, and I think, oh, that's a really good idea. Or it will come up in the comments of one of my videos. So I get my ideas from different places, and I just put them in that spreadsheet. So I'm constantly, adding things. So at the beginning of this year, I, looked at the spreadsheet again, and I eliminated, all of the ones that I've already done, to look at my ideas for 2021. And I still have 130 ideas. So I'm always coming up with new ideas. And the ideas that I come with from one year to the next are just different, because there's a limit to how many 7-minute videos I can do on this cast on method, or this increase or that decrease. So I'm just shifting kind of into what is interesting to me, or what I see people are needing more of, or what I haven't covered. So it comes from a lot of different places. A lot of them comes from you guys and questions you have, and I just put them in that file, and then at some point I'll think, what am I going to do? And I look at my list and think, oh, here's what I can do for the next couple of weeks. So sometimes I'll have like a plan for a few weeks in a row, and sometimes it's Saturday or Sunday and I'm thinking, what am I going to do? And I want something easy, and so I look at my list and see what I can do. Do I have a favorite knitting reference book? I do have a couple, and they are not within reach. They are further over, and I have a table in the way here right now that makes me not be able to reach it. I've done videos on my library several times. The last time was probably in the fall of 2019. So starting around September into October, there's every Casual Friday went over a different section of my library. And things change over time. Certain books really grow on me over time. My favorite book is by Monsey Stanley. It's called The Knitter's Handbook, and I think it's out of print now, but you can usually get copies used off Amazon or maybe Abe Books or someplace like that. I find it amazing, and she has 40 different ways to cast on, and she tells you how, why this group of cast on methods might be used, or what this particular bind off is good for, or what kind of situation. So she really explains why and how you might want to use something. And what I love about that book is the section on increasing and decreasing. Anytime she gives you an increase or a decrease. She tells you how to do the mirror of it, and she tells you how to do it from the purl side. So that's amazing. So I love that book. And Principles of Knitting has really grown on me. I didn't like it at first because I felt like if you were trying to look something up, like I don't know how to do a make one increase, you wouldn't be able to look it up in that book. And frankly, a lot of times you wouldn't be able to look it up in Monty Stanley's book either. Their books really, they're organized in a certain way and they categorize techniques in a certain way. And it's really the kind of book where you sit down to learn. And you might be learning about a particular type of technique and then look at the different options. And she also, that's June Hemmons Hyatt, she will also explain when something might be useful and what kind of situation you might want to use it in. A few months ago, I was doing a video on a type of sewn bind-off that is frequently attributed to Elizabeth Zimmerman as the outline stitch bind-off or the casting on cast-off. So it looks like the long tail cast-on, only it's a bind-off. And it's a type of sewn bind-off where you have to measure off a long tail, thread it, and then the whole span of yarn has to go through each stitch. And in my head, I only knew 3 different types of sewn bind-offs. There's the sewn bind-off, there's that outline stitch bind-off, and then there's the grafted bind-off, which you use for like a tubular bind-off. And I wondered if there were any other sewn bind-offs. So I looked in each of those 2 books, and neither one of those books refers to those as the sewn bind-off, the outline stitch bind-off, or well, they might, the third one, the grafted bind-off, they might refer to it that way. But they had different names for these same techniques. And so trying to look up those in the index of those books would have been difficult, but I just went to the section where they were talking about this category of binding off. But those are my 2 favorite books. I'm knitting a baby sweater that requires me to knit the button band separately and attach it to the sweater by seaming. I hate this. Is there a way to attach it as I knit it? So now I assume that it's something like a knit one, purl one ribbing, and that it's knit in the same direction as the actual sweater is. So typically ribbing is like the bands are knit on a smaller needle so that it gives you a firmer fabric. And so that is why if you were knitting both the sweater and the button band in the same direction, and they have to be on different size needles, you would do it separately and seam it. So that was a very common method of doing button bands going way back. And I finally found the perpendicular kind of button band in a sweater in one of these 40s, but usually it's like 1950s to 60s before you see where you pick up stitches along that edge and then you knit perpendicularly. So, you know, I think the only way that you could do it and keep that smaller needle would be to have the ribbing stitches on smaller needle and the rest of it on a bigger needle, and then knit the ribbing and then switch to a bigger needle. That you'd have to have 2 sets of needles going, and that would be kind of a pain. So if it's important to have the ribbing in knit one, purl one that's going in that direction, usually it's like knit in a strip and around, and then sewn on, that's why you want to do it. So you could choose to use a different ribbing attachment to your sweater, but it would be perpendicular. Like this sweater was actually knit, the band is garter stitch, and it was knit at the same time as the sweater. And that used to be pretty common. I don't do that too often, but this particular sweater called for that. Could you suggest a pattern and video tutorial for first socks? I don't have a suggestion for that. Well, here's what I did. You may not want to do that. There certainly are other videos that go through this. When I knit my first socks, there was a tutorial on Knitty called something like Socks 101, and I think it was by Kate Atherley, and it was to use worsted weight yarn on a set of double points or whatever, and just took you through the whole process of doing a heel flap, picking up stitches, turning the heel, all of that, just so you could kind of understand what each section of it was about. And once I understood how that worked and what was going on, then I was able to just knit a pair of socks. A lot of people use a tutorial called Silver Sock Class. I have a tutorial called the August Sock Knit-along that's really meant for custom fitting socks. Most sock patterns assume certain proportions for your feet. Some people knit their first socks with my tutorial. But my assumption is that you would have knit some socks before and that now you are ready to tackle custom fitting and adjusting different types of heels and toes in order to fit. I don't personally have a pattern that I can recommend. But what I will say is that, like everything in knitting, it's a process that it's likely the first pair you knit is not going to be perfect. May not fit you, hopefully will fit somebody, at least they'll be able to wear them. And so a lot of sock knitting is, because they do need to fit to be really wearable, a lot of it is just learning through the process of knitting socks, like what you like doing. Do you like cuff down? Do you like toe up? Do you like this kind of heel? Do you like that kind of heel? Do you like stitch patterns? Do you like self-striping yarn? Which kinds of heels by default fit you better, and which ones do you need to modify? And that just takes time and experience trying them all and seeing what you like. I've been knitting socks for 15 years, and I've been able to wear pretty much every pair I've knit, but some of them fit way better than the others. And I'm still learning techniques and tweaking, and that's part of what's keeping it interesting for me. But I would say just try and see what happens. And I would do a sock that uses maybe a little bit thicker yarn, like a 6-ply instead of a 4-ply, just so that it's a little faster to get through. There are volume problems. Well, how's that? Is that better? Do I have any? Oh, it just jumps again. Any video on Jenny interlock bind off? I don't know what that is. Can anyone join the Knitting Guild? Yes. Well, at least Minnesota Knitters Guild, anybody can join. You can be from any state. We just had our Sunday brunch knitting group before this live stream, and there's somebody who's even on the board of the guild who lives in Washington, D.C. But we have, people been joining our knitting groups who are from Arkansas, Oregon, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, all over. People join our particular knitting guild. And we're doing our programs by Zoom every month. And you don't even have to be a member of our guild to go to the programs. You do have to see the program, you have to register, and then so that you can enter the Zoom. But our guild doesn't even require you to be a member to see the programs. But you can certainly be a member of our guild regardless of where you live. Can I show a crochet provisional cast on? Sometimes it works fine for me, but others the yarn catches on every other stitch and needs to be cut. I have done a series of videos using the crochet cast on, but I use it in a slightly different way that works really well and creates actually a lifeline rather than needing to unzip the crochet cast on. So I do have a series of videos using the crochet cast on, showing how to do the crochet cast on, but how to use it in a different way than is typically used. Have I ever thought about an advanced university degree related to knitting? And if so, what would be your area of study? I have thought about some sort of, I've thought about it. I haven't pursued this, but just wondering what sorts of universities in our country would have that sort of program. There's a lot in the UK, and when it comes to fashion history and material culture and lots of things that people are exploring and knitting that way, and I've been attending a lot of their programs that they have for free that they welcome the public to. I really enjoy learning, and I really enjoy doing research, but I'm very sort of scattershot at it. It would probably be helpful to me personally to be more disciplined about it. But I haven't really thought about pursuing it in any sort of direct way. Would I consider doing a knit along using cables on a small project like a hat or fingerless gloves? You know, there's a lot of different approaches of doing knit-alongs and a lot of different things that people do. I think one of the things I have realized about myself, even though I do produce patterns sometimes, is I really like showing people options. So like my August sock knit-along helps you get through a sock, but it's not a direct set of instructions. It's here's how you can custom do something, and that tends to be more interesting to me. That doesn't mean I wouldn't do it. I think I would have, I'm not sure. I'd have to figure out what that would mean. I thought about doing other knit-alongs like for toe-up socks. People have asked me to do knit-alongs for sweaters or for this thing or for that thing. And it would have to be something that I would find really compelling personally as well, and be really interested in teaching. So I just don't know. There's like so many ideas. And these kinds of things, they take a lot of time to prepare for and write materials for. And so that's the kind of thing I have to kind of keep in mind as well. But if that's something you guys are interested in, more knit-alongs of some sort, you can always throw those ideas at me. And if I see something that I find as interesting as you guys find, then that's usually when I latch onto it. You are so skilled at organizing and presenting information. Thank you. Have you considered publishing a knitting book? If so, what interests you? One of the great things about doing like videos that are 10 or 15 minutes long is that I'm only having to focus on organizing that particular piece of information and put it into context of other pieces of information. A book is a very large project. I am sort of in the background working on a book that's related to my long-term vintage knitting project. So like a chapter on each of the different sweaters and the construction methods and the techniques used during that decade and how techniques were evolving and that kind of thing. So that's something that I'm kind of working on in the background. The problem is that book publishing is a whole different kettle of fish, and you can do self-publishing now, but that's a lot of work. And working with a publisher means that they need to feel like they can market your book in some way, and they put a lot of the work into it so that you don't have to in terms of producing the actual physical copy, which means that they take 85% of the money for it too. So you know, it's just hard. I certainly have a degree in writing. I love writing. It interests me to no end. I like writing articles. So at this point in my life, I need my writing things to be a little bit more contained. Doesn't mean I'm never going to write a book or finish a book, but you know, if you have a book project, you really need to focus on the book project, which means that other things have to be let go, like doing weekly videos, for example. So it just depends on what is keeping me motivated and what brings me joy. Is vintage in the fiber yarn knitting world clearly defined, i.e. 25, 40, 50 years or so? The way I understand it is antique is anything 100 years old or older. So that's why I sometimes refer to working with antique sweater patterns versus vintage. So my 1960s pattern is definitely a vintage pattern, where the ones I've knit previously have been antique patterns, except for maybe the 1930s still qualifies as vintage. So the All Things Vintage group on Ravelry, I think it's 40 or 50 years, something like that. It is somewhere around 40 or 50 years for it to be considered vintage. But there's also this term retro. And so it turns out all of the knitting that I did when I learned to knit in the 80s is now either retro or vintage. So the longer I knit, the older my things are being, the labels are changing. Do I have a favorite Fair Isle stranded stitch dictionary? I have a bunch of them. So Fair Isle is a specific subset of stranded color work. And so Fair Isle motifs are going to reflect the kinds of motifs that you see in the Shetland Islands, that kind of knitting. So they're going to tend to be smaller number of stitches between repeats. So like Norwegian sweaters, that's a different type of color work. There's in Northern Europe, there are lots of different stranded color work traditions, and the way that they use colors and motifs are very different from each other. So I have a lot of different books on stranded color work. And so some of those are books that are related to a particular type of accessory, like mittens or socks. And so you can see how those kinds of mittens are done in stranded color work, and see how those kinds of mittens are constructed, but also see the kinds of color work. So for me, I like having a variety of stitch dictionaries. I don't typically have, you know, one that I will go to regularly. Thanks, Solar Flare Babe. What kind of yarn would you recommend to knit a dress with? I have no idea. I have no idea. Probably something pretty fine gauge that's going to hold up, and you can avoid the sag in the rear end. But I have no idea. I know it was a pretty common thing, like in the 40s and 50s, and they knit with very fine gauge yarns. How do you keep your projects tidy and together as you work on them? Project bags, Ziplocs. That changes over time. So these days, I tend to work on just a couple of projects at a time. But if something goes into hibernation, like if I'm working on something in the middle of the summer and I'm like, oh, I'm sick of this, and I'll address it for finish it February, then you can't really see them in here, but I have another set of these over on this wall, and they have these kind of plastic bins that fit in there, and so I might stick one in there for a while. My desk is also made of some of this IKEA stuff, and it has some of these little cube storages in it, and I have some of those bins. So I have one bin in my desk where I keep my yarn for technique videos. Like I have the specific colors, like this kind of blue color that works well on video, and I keep that in a bin in my desk, and then the other bin is whatever my works in progress are. And these days I really don't have very many, and that's because doing like finish it February over the past few years that I just address them every year, and also because of doing videos where people are seeing my progress, I might tend to stick with a project longer than I would have if nobody was watching. So I don't tend to have a lot of projects. If I'm knitting in public, like if I'm going to a knitting group in the days when you could do that, then I would put things in a project bag, and I have different sizes depending on what they are. A sock would go in like a little pouch type of thing with a drawstring. I probably have 20 different canvas tote bags. I think every knitter has a million of those. So if I'm packing on a trip, I will put things in Ziploc bags to keep them together in my suitcase. So everybody has their way, and like I said, it just depends. Over time, things change. Could I speak about the properties of fabric in sweaters that are knitted sideways? I mean, I've seen those and I understand how they work. I have never done them. I mean, it's going to depend on the stitch pattern you use. Any stitch pattern could be more restrictive in how it stretches if you're, widthways or lengthways, depending on what you're using. That's a situation where row gauge is going to be more where it's going to be important, because especially if you were doing some kind of stitch pattern. But otherwise, I don't know that I have anything specific. I think it's always going to be dependent on the stitch pattern, what the fabric qualities have, regardless of whether it's knit vertically or horizontally. Would I consider compiling a list of all the historical knitting resources you've discovered? I wish I had done that from the beginning. I do have a list on in my Ravelry group. When you go to the Ravelry group, there at the top, there's like you can look at discussion or pages, or there's a few different things. But if you go to where it says pages, I have a different page for a bunch of different things. Like I'll put all my Casual Friday videos in a particular year will be embedded in there in order. I have a page that has all of the articles, links to all of the articles I've written for Interweave and what issue of magazine, and then a link to their blog where they have posted the article. And then I have a page that has some links to some historical things. I tend to mention them in videos and link to them in the discussion, and then I don't always keep that link in my own documentation. So sometimes I'm having to go back and look at it. So as organized as some of you guys think I am, not as organized as I would like to be. Did I finish my Latvian mittens? I did not. Do you have any hints or tips for designing your own knits, especially Aran sweaters? I learned about knitting Aran sweaters when I did a knit along back in 2005 from Janet Zabo. Is this in here? Oh, here it is. And it's out of print. Maybe it's available to use. It's called Aran Sweater Design by Janet Zwartbles. So she was writing this particular book at the time we were doing the knit along. And she's written another book besides. I think she's more into quilting now than she is into knitting. She used to have a newsletter, and she designed a lot of Aran related things in the past. So I learned a lot about how to lay out an Aran sweater and how to knit one, like all the different options. When we did the knit along, she had selected all the cables, because that is a different skill than just taking cables and designing something where all the cables are going to fit in a particular shape. There's a skill to finding cables that work well together. And so like the sweater I just did, when I look at it, I'm like, it's pretty good, but I should have done this instead of that. I wish I had done a panel that had something that was more angular. Everything's pretty round. So I think, you know, there's some tricks for that. I did a video, not this December, but the December before, so 2019 or maybe 2018. When I was first designing that Aran sweater, I did some Casual Friday videos that kind of showed the things to think about for Aran sweater design. But if you can get a copy of this book used, I would recommend it. She tells you how to do it bottom up or top down. When we took the knit along, it was saddle shoulder, top down. And she likes seamless construction. I prefer knitting the front and back separately and seaming them, but you could do it either way. So I really do recommend that book. Tips for multiple color changes at the same time. I don't understand. I can knit the colors fine, but where I add them always leads to a kind of a mess. Oh, like if you're joining a new color? Yeah, that's going to happen. That's because when you have two stitches next to each other that are the same color, they are joined at the base with a running thread. And when you join a new strand of yarn, whether it's the same color or not, and that tail is just hanging there, you don't have that running thread. So you have to find a way to create that running thread, either by, if there's two tails hanging there, one from one color and one from the other, when you go to weave them in, you need to link them like this around each other and then weave them in opposite directions. I think I have a video on that. Probably like look in finishing techniques or weaving in ends or something like that. But that you're always going to get those holes. It's always going to look terrible until you've woven the ends in, and then it'll look fine. Do I have to watch my hands when I knit? If not, how do you learn to knit without watching? I do. It depends on what I'm knitting, and it kind of depends on the thickness of the yarn. I find watching my knitting mesmerizing. Like sometimes if I'm watching one of my own knitting videos, I just get entranced by what I just like to watch the knitting. So I tend to pick TV shows to stream that don't really require a lot of visual attention, because what happens is I put it down and I'll watch. I can knit if it's pretty easy without looking, but I have never made an effort to try to do that. And I certainly have tried to tell the difference by feeling. Some people can tell, they can feel the knits and purls, and I do not have that ability, certainly, and I haven't been motivated enough to be able to do that. Some people can knit in the dark in a movie theater. Lights go out, my knitting goes down. So I don't have tips for that. Thank you for your tidbits. Pretty interesting. My question, what color red is your 1890s sweater? I'm in search of a particular red for a project, and I love that one. If you go to my Ravelry profile to look at my notebook, you can see that sweater, and the yarn is from Brown Sheep Company, and I think it's called Nature's Spun, and it's a particular red, and I don't remember if it's cardinal, if they called it cardinal, or if there was a different color name that they use, but it's a very much a blue red. But you can see, I have the name of the color in that project page, but I don't remember off the top of my head. It might have been scarlet or cardinal. It's one of those two. Like the pattern called for one, and that one had the other name. Do I have knitting tools which you have inherited or been given and hold sentimental value for you, and do you use them? So when my grandmother died in 1991, 1992, it was about this time of year, and I think it must have been 92 because I think she was 91 years old. My mother and I went, she and my grandpa died 3 weeks apart, and my mom's an only child. So I went with her to the apartment to kind of go through all of their stuff, and I got all of her knitting related things. I'd been a knitter at that time for about 5 years. And so I got her, she had one of the, it was kind of a canvas knitting bag type of thing. It had a wooden frame that was kind of like an X. So it could fold up like this, but if it was like that, then it would stand on the ground next to the chair. So I took that, I took all her knitting needles, all of her crochet hooks, and all of her knitting patterns and crochet patterns. So I have all of those. Now I used to, all of her crochet hooks, that used to be the only crochet hooks I had were hers. And I kept them in my notions bag. And on a flight back to Michigan, I got rerouted and I had to take 2 different planes, and I left the notions bag in the front, the seat in front of me, and I'm sick about it. And so I lost some of those crochet hooks. She had crappy knitting needles, so I don't use those. My niece, who really loves family history and who is a knitter as well, when she was in college and didn't have a lot of money to buy stuff, I gave those knitting needles to her. And I think I gave her the knitting bag too, because I don't have that knitting stand anymore. Those are things that she definitely wanted and I knew that she would treasure. So she had those. The vintage patterns have been the thing that I have come to be so happy about, because I was never interested in knitting anything vintage, but I really liked having those because they're the patterns that she used to make things for us when we were kids. And so I see the poncho pattern, I see the sweater patterns, you know, and I love that I have those. But I'm really sad. They're like Susan Bates crochet hooks, but still they were my grandma's, and I regret not having those. What are the, oh, this keeps jumping. What are the advantages and disadvantages of different heel types when knitting socks? Socks are typically designed by formula, which makes it really easy to know what to do at each part of the sock. And so certain types of heels have naturally, when you knit them by formula, will naturally fit some feet better than others. So I used to only knit heel flap and gusset because I have such a high instep and I couldn't wear a peasant heel, excuse me, or a short row heel. But then a few years ago, I'm like, I am going to figure out exactly how to modify these so they will fit, because the instructions for modification for those tend to be pretty vague. Oh, well, I just add a few stitches here, or I use a bigger percentage there. And I'm like, that doesn't work. It helps, but it doesn't work well. So I set out to figure out exactly how you could figure out what you would need to do. And so I've done a series of videos on that, and that's part of the August Sock Knit Along. Is if this is the kind of heel you want, here's what you need to know: whether or not you're going to have fit issues, and then how to correct those fit issues. And so that's what that tutorial does. So it really, at this point in my sock knitting life, I choose a sock heel based on what I want my knitting experience to be, or what I want the appearance to be, because I know that I can modify it in order to make a good fit. Having said that, a heel flap, the heel stitch, is a cushier, thicker fabric, because it condenses the stitch and row gauge and it makes it a thicker, and so ostensibly it won't wear as much. People tend to wear out the socks on the sole though, not so much on the back of the heel. So I think maybe it's more of a comfort thing. And again, with toes, same type of thing, where you can use different types of toes and you can learn to adjust them based on the shape of your feet and the length of your toes. So really it's a matter of what process do you like, what appearance do you like, and what you feel like doing. Okay, it's been over an hour, you guys, and you are full of questions. So I'm gonna go for like maybe 5 or 10 more minutes. I'm gonna try to answer as many as I can. Is it okay to knit with superwash and non-superwash together? Usually I wouldn't, but I'm doing the piñata hat brioche. I think, you know, they're going to behave a little bit differently as they're worn. I think it's probably okay, but you need to wash it the way that the one that is not superwash needs to be washed. So you can't throw it in the washer because that's going to shrink the one that is not superwash. They're going to have different textures, and they have different amounts of drape to them. But I would say try it and see what happens and see if you like it or not, and then you will be more informed the next time you're tempted to do that. Did you get a knitting belt from Bob and Weave? My knitting belt I bought from Schoolhouse Press probably 15 years ago, and I don't think they're selling them anymore. There is, Bob and Weave is this local company. I mentioned them a couple of weeks ago. In the tidbit, there was somebody who was a one-handed knitter, and then I noticed that she had this knitting belt that had different size holes in it that would be good for different size knitting needles. And she had met, the woman in the video had mentioned she'd gotten it from someone in Minneapolis, and there were a couple of people who said, oh, that's Bob and Weave. And so the next week I mentioned that in the video along with another video of a different knitter who's also one-handed and had a different way of approaching the knitting. But my knitting belt is from years ago, and it was not from Bob and Weave. What's my go-to baby knit for friends having a baby? I'm looking for inspiration, but I have no kids, so don't really know what is useful. It depends on the baby. I like knitting hats because you can make some really fun, crazy, silly hats for babies, and they have no say about whether or not it goes in their heads. It just looks so cute. So there's one by Susan B. Anderson. It's in the like nursery knits or baby knits. I'm trying to see where it is on my shelf. I think it's Itty Bitty Nursery Knits. There's a hat in there that I just love. It's a cupcake hat with a cherry on top, and there are little tiny mittens that go with it with little cherries on them. I've made that before. The cupcake hat I really like. The past few babies that have come into my life have been a little like more special, like my grandnephew, so I made him a grandpa cardigan. And I love seeing a baby in a grandpa cardigan. And then another one was for a baby that my daughter in the Netherlands was an au pair for, and so I made something really special. But usually my go-to is hats, and to make them to fit the baby the next winter after they're born. That tends to be what I do, and I just like crazy cute hats, and there's tons of them. But I do like that cupcake hat, and I've knit some other hats too that I think were my own design recently. But yeah, so let's see. The bag of black lambswool, were you able to use it for spinning? Never. And I'm like, it was one of those, when I first learned to spin and I went to this place and I put my hand inside a Ziploc bag of lambswool, it was black lambswool, and I loved the feel of it, and I bought it, and it was very short, and I do not have the spinning skills for that. And then it's black. It's going to be like a nightmare to try to knit anyway. So, am I still spinning? You haven't talked about it in a while. Yeah, I haven't. My spinning wheel hasn't made it into this office. I moved into this room in December, and my spinning wheel is in a bedroom that has both my girls' furniture all in that same room. And so I haven't finished setting up my old office as a bedroom. That was one of my Finish It February projects that I didn't do yet. So I don't have my spinning wheel in here, but I will return to it someday. Are you over your aversion to toe up socks? I think that I'm still, you know, finding ways to make it I would say palatable to me. So my aversion came from when I first learned to knit socks, and there was very little information about toe up and very little information about modifications for my kind of hard to fit foot. And so I got very good at the heel that I was knitting for myself and the techniques, and really learning a lot of tips and techniques and tweaks to get really good fitting socks. But in the past couple of years, I've really branched out into other heels, and so now I thought, well, I should do more toe up. So I'm still exploring them. I needed to get through, finish February, finish those sweaters. So as I'm knitting socks this year, I'm sure I'll be doing more toe up, but I don't know that I'll ever love it in the same way that I have this deep love for cuff down. Okay, so I'm going to do one more question, and I promise I'll be doing another live stream at some point in the future, but this has been going on for a while, so you guys are probably getting tired of me. Let's see. What is my favorite vintage knitting book? Oy, that is hard. I'm looking at... Oh, it's actually a pattern booklet, so it's not up here, but it's a knitting manual. There's two of them from the 30s and 40s. I think Columbia Minerva was one of them, and I can't remember the other one. But they were really showing how to design your own sweaters. All the patterns in there only had one size. But they were showing you how to make modifications and how to plan out your own sweater using a schematic on a grid, kind of like what I was showing yesterday or Friday in the video. And they even included a top-down raglan, like showing it laid out. It was just a really great way of presenting patterns, I thought, and explaining how to do those kinds of modifications. And it's during a time period when maybe people who didn't grow up learning to knit and were learning to knit in that interwar period between World War I and II, they started giving more information to knitters. And this was an interesting way that they did that, and then it kind of disappeared. So I think those are my favorite because they're just fascinating, and they've actually taught me a lot about how to approach designing my own as well. Okay, so I think you guys, it's been almost an hour and a half, and I know I didn't get every single question, but I tried to answer as many as I could, and I promise I will do another live stream sometime probably in the next month. Maybe try planning doing them once a month. We'll see how it goes. But thanks a lot. I really appreciate everybody showing up, and I will see you next week.